Welcome to the Psychology Department's video tutorial on classical conditioning. This video assumes that you are already familiar with the early work of Ivan Pavlov and understand the similarities and differences between the unconditioned stimulus, or US, the unconditioned response, or UR, the conditioned stimulus, or CS, and the conditioned response, or CR, both in general and as they relate to Pavlov's dogs. Remember, classical conditioning is one type of learning that you will be expected to know about. This video introduces you to more vocabulary related to the basics of classical conditioning. Let's start with a reminder of the definition of classical conditioning. Classical conditioning occurs when a previously neutral stimulus comes to elicit a response through its associations with the stimulus that naturally brings about that response. It would be great if you could get really good at filling in a diagram, so let's take a quick moment to review the relationship between the US, UR, CS, and CR. Before conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus elicits the unconditioned response, but the neutral stimulus does not elicit that response. During conditioning, the neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus, which creates an association between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. After conditioning, the neutral stimulus is no longer neutral. It now serves as a conditioned stimulus that elicits a conditioned response. By plugging in Pavlov's dog example, you have a model that can be used as an analogy to apply to future examples of classically conditioned responses. Before conditioning, food in the mouth elicits salivation, and the tone all by itself does not elicit salivation. During conditioning, the tone is paired with the food because the food elicits salivation. After conditioning, the tone all by itself elicits salivation. Notice that salivation is written in both the UR and CR boxes. If you are filling in a diagram and you did not put in the same behavior in those two boxes, then you have done something wrong. The UR and CR are the same behavioral response. What makes them different is the stimulus that elicits them. The UR is salivation to the food in the mouth. This is natural. The CR is salivation to the tone. This was learned. I have no doubt that your introductory psychology textbook includes the story of Little Albert. The experiment, Conducting on Little Albert by John Watson and Rosalie Rayner, serves as a very useful example of classical conditioning to further your understanding of this type of learning. The experiment was devised by Watson in order to provide evidence that fear is a learned reaction to environmental stimuli. Thus, Watson set out to condition an infant to fear their white lab rats. Before I introduce you to more new vocabulary, let's go through the US, UR, CS, and CR of Watson's Little Albert experiment. Before conditioning, Watson established that the white lab rats were in fact neutral. You see in this video footage that Little Albert is not afraid of a white rat, a brown rabbit, a medium-sized dog, or even a monkey on a leash. We know, however, that a loud noise will naturally bring about a startle or fear response. During conditioning, Watson paired the rat with a loud noise by presenting the rat and then having Rayner hit a steel bar with a hammer behind Albert's head. Rayner did not make the loud noise when Albert was presented with other things to play with. Over time, the presentation of the white rat all by itself, that is, without the loud noise, would cause Albert to cry in fear and attempt to crawl away from the rat. They had successfully conditioned Albert to fear the rat. When and how does classical conditioning happen? There are certain conditions that make it more likely for a neutral stimulus to become a conditioned stimulus. Let's review some of those now. The neutral stimulus needs to have some predictive value. That is, it needs to reliably predict the forthcoming presence of the unconditioned stimulus. I have a few characteristics listed under the general category of predictive value for us to go over. Timing is important. The conditioned stimulus must come before the unconditioned stimulus. This should make some intuitive sense to you if you stop and think about it, and it helps to consider Pavlov's dog experiment and Watson's little Albert experiment as examples. The tone must come before the food in order to condition the dogs to salivate to the tone. Remember, it goes like this. Tone followed by food causes salivation. Tone followed by food causes salivation. Tone followed by food causes salivation, until the tone all by itself can elicit salivation, because of its association with the food. It would not make sense to have the food followed by the tone. The dog is already salivating to the food, so the tone has no predictive value. Similarly, the rat was presented to Albert before the loud noise. The neutral stimulus is more likely to become a conditioned stimulus if it precedes the unconditioned stimulus and is close in time before the unconditioned stimulus. It is helpful to think of the conditioned stimulus as a useful signal that the unconditioned stimulus is on its way. If the neutral stimulus occurs too far in advance of the unconditioned stimulus or after the unconditioned stimulus, it is not a useful signal. In most instances, there needs to be a frequent pairing of the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus in order for classical conditioning to occur. Just how many pairings depends on other factors, and it is not impossible for classical conditioning to occur after just one pairing. A conditioned taste aversion is a good example of one trial learning, that is, when it might only take one pairing to learn to avoid a certain food. There's more about this on the next slide. The intensity of the conditioned stimulus makes a difference. Pavlov's dogs needed to notice the metronome sound. The sound needed to be intense enough to go from neutral to conditioned. The distinctiveness of the neutral stimulus will also make a difference. If Pavlov's dogs were exposed to lots of ticking noises in the lab at various times, then the ticking of the metronome might not be distinct enough to become a conditioned stimulus. In addition to predictive value, we seem to be biologically prepared to learn certain associations. For example, we learn to fear living things more quickly than non-living things. I could condition you to fear paper cups, using the same steps that Watson used to create a fear of rats in Albert. But it would take more pairings and the fear would not last as long. Quoting an example from SparkNotes.com, Joe eats pepperoni pizza while watching a movie with his roommate, and 3 hours later he becomes nauseated. He may develop an aversion to pepperoni pizza, but he won't develop an aversion to the movie he was watching or to his roommate, even though they were also present at the same time as the pizza. Joe's roommate and the movie won't become conditioned stimuli, but the pizza will. If, right after eating the pizza, Joe gets a sharp pain in his elbow instead of nausea, it's unlikely that he will develop an aversion to pizza as a result. Unlike nausea, the pain won't act as an unconditioned stimulus. We have American psychologist John Garcia to thank for shedding a lot of light on conditioned taste aversions. This example illustrates that classical conditioning is much more complex than Pavlov ever imagined. Now let's add some new vocabulary to your knowledge base. The conditioning period, whereby the neutral stimulus precedes the unconditioned stimulus until it becomes a conditioned stimulus, is referred to as acquisition. That is, the learned response to the conditioned stimulus is acquired because of the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus association. This figure is illustrating that the strength of the conditioned response will increase over time with continued pairings, until reaching a peak or maximum level. For example, the tone will produce a small amount of drooling from Pavlov's dogs at first, but with continued pairing with the food, the tone all by itself will elicit greater amounts of salivation. Once a classically conditioned response has been acquired, it can be eliminated. Pavlov repeatedly exposed the conditioned dogs to the tone without the food in order to get rid of the salivation to the tone. The result of exposure to the conditioned stimulus without the pairing with the unconditioned stimulus is called extinction. I think it is unfortunate that this result came to be known as extinction, because we know now that the original learning is not destroyed. It is not gone forever, as the name extinction implies. Pavlov noticed that he could successfully extinguish salivation in his dogs by making sure not to follow the tone with food, but the following new day the dogs would again salivate to the tone. He called this spontaneous recovery. As you can see from the figure, the strength of the conditioned response during spontaneous recovery is less than the maximum amount during the acquisition period, but nevertheless there is a response. Extinction should really be called inhibition. The conditioned response is inhibited when the CS and the US are no longer associated with one another in the environment. But the term you need to know is extinction, because that is the technical vocabulary used by psychologists. Before we conclude this video, let's cover two more vocabulary words associated with classical conditioning: stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. Remember that Watson and Rayner conditioned little Albert to have a fear response to white rats. They noticed, however, that Albert generalized this fear to other similar stimuli. That is, even though they had not paired the loud noise with other white furry things, Albert showed fear to other white furry things, such as white rabbits and even a Santa Claus mask. Here you see Albert showing a fear response to a brown rabbit. For Albert, the brown rabbit was similar enough to the white rat that he generalized his fear to them. Albert's fear of white rabbits is an example of stimulus generalization. If Albert only showed fear of white rabbits, but not of brown rabbits, then we would say that he generalized his fear of rats to rabbits, but he discriminated between white and brown rabbits. This concludes our video tutorial on classical conditioning, focusing on stimulus characteristics that strengthen conditioned responses, as well as some basic vocabulary. There are more video tutorials on this topic and how it relates to other types of learning. Thank you.